4th of January 2026. Now, the new year was barely born even before America suddenly decided to do an extrajudicial kidnapping in nearby Venezuela. Now, forgive me, but everybody's talking about this at the moment, and I don't want to just ignore it because it's not relevant to us. It is relevant to us in some ways. It's worth remembering that there's a thing called international law. Now, in international law, extrajudicial kidnappings, imprisonment of other countries' leaders is illegal. You're not allowed to do this. The Americans have just gone and done it. They appear to have softened up Venezuela with a bombing campaign first, and then we see 6 helicopters from the Snatch Squad, presumably flying Nicolas Maduro and his wife out of Venezuela and into custody in the United States. Now, let's face it, Venezuela has been struggling for a long time, but it shouldn't be struggling because Venezuela is very, very wealthy in oil. It has a lot of oil, but it's struggling with very high inflation. I think the inflation rate in Venezuela recently, as recently as last week, was 43%. And people in Venezuela have been out on the streets in their hundreds of thousands complaining about the way the country was being run by Nicolas Maduro. Now, Maduro himself is obviously no angel. He had been fixing the results of recent elections. That tampering was well known. And I think in the last election that there was, which was, I believe, by-election, one of his own candidates basically got gubbed. And the result of that election, that by-election, was also pocketed to make it look as if the Maduro's party had won. And they refused to accept the result of the democratic vote of the people in that instance. So people in Venezuela are deeply unhappy with Maduro. He is and was a despot, a dictator. But he was, I think, as far as the Americans go, a useful dictator for a while. The American state has a long, long history of propping up dictators in South American countries because most of the time they are very right-wing. And that is a sort of block to any kind of communism or socialism taking root in these countries. And this is really the reason why America has always meddled in the affairs of South American countries. This latest exploit, if you like, of snatching the leader from under the noses of the Venezuelans themselves must have had some inside help. There's no way that they would have known where Maduro was unless somebody on the inside was feeding them information and making sure that they went to the right place to pick Maduro up. That could only really have come from the Venezuelan military. And they have been also deeply unhappy at the way Maduro has been managing the country. And obviously, it's they really, I think, who have engineered this situation and possibly, and this is just speculation, asked for the Americans' help in getting rid of him. So the Americans have obligingly done this on the basis that he's some kind of drug lord and that they're going to put him on trial for drug offences. Now, Venezuela does not have a huge drugs manufacturing industry, unlike some other South American countries. And so it's very hard to reconcile this snatch with the claim that this was because he was importing drugs into the United States. We also saw some highly illegal acts of piracy by the United States, where they were blasting anything, any speedboat or cruiser out of the water, which was heading from Venezuelan waters through the Gulf of Mexico towards the United States. And literally, they just blasted everything out of the water that they thought might be a drug boat. In many cases, these were innocent civilians that were wiped out by American airstrikes. Nobody batted an eyelid. Why is it important to Scotland? Well, there are some parallels here, and I think the most obvious parallel is oil. The Americans know there is a lot of oil in Venezuelan territory. They also seem to have made a good connection with the Venezuelan military. And people are speculating that American oil companies will probably now move into Venezuela and take over production and export of oil. Now, that is not, absolutely concrete either. This is speculation. But for them to do that, then there must have been a plan all along, because if the oil companies were waiting for the removal of the Venezuelan leader before moving in, then there had to have been a long-term plan for this within the Venezuelan military and the United States Foreign Affairs Department as a partner in this. So it is about oil. And because it's about oil, it is relevant to Scotland. Because Scotland, as we all know, is the natural owner, the lawful owner of all the oil in the Scottish sector of the North Sea, the North Atlantic, the northwest of Scotland, and in other places as well within our territorial boundaries. And that makes us vulnerable to this type of interference, not necessarily by the United States. But imagine for a moment if, for example, and this is just hypothetical, the United Kingdom decided, having seen the Americans successfully snatch somebody from another country and then take it over, because Donald Trump has said that America is going to run Venezuela until a suitable transition government can be elected. Now that strikes me as taking over an entire country. I mean, it's a bit like Trump saying he wanted Greenland and just moving into Greenland and taking it over. And the Greenlanders must be very worried about what's happening at the moment. Scotland obviously is different. The United States doesn't have any claim on our oil. It's a bit far away for them as well. Plus, according to the United States and the UK government, the UK owns the oil reserves in the Scottish sector. So there is that. So it's very unlikely the Americans would snatch anybody from here, for example. Now, the Scottish leader, John Swinney, came out yesterday with what can only be described as a very mild-mannered comment, because it wasn't really a direct condemnation, saying that it was deeply concerned about recent events in Venezuela, and that we should all be concerned to apply international law in scenarios like this. But it wasn't a direct condemnation, it wasn't a criticism of the US. Keir Starmer is just the same. Rather than coming out and condemning this, he's now said he wants to meet with Donald Trump to discuss it. I mean, what's to discuss? It's pretty obvious the Americans just went in and snatched the leader of Venezuela. It's not really in question. The question is, if the leader of a country is perceived by some other powerful neighbour to be a bit of a pain, is getting in the way, or maybe has the wrong kind of politics, and there's a lot of oil at stake, they could just snatch him. They could just kidnap him and his family, remove that head of state, and move in with their own oil companies to snatch whatever is there. Now, you might say, well, in Scotland's case, the oil's already being snatched. It's being snatched as we speak. It's being siphoned off all the time, and it's been siphoned off since it was discovered back in 1973. So the ongoing oil theft is really not something new to us. But the idea that a country outside of somewhere else can move straight in there and take it over and run it is not foreign to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has an even longer rap sheet of taking over other people's countries and exploiting their resources. It was known as the British Empire. Most of it is now gone, but the remaining part, as we like to call it, the last colony of the British Empire, is in fact Scotland. And the fact that we have a teetering version of democracy of our own, where we are allowed, as one right-wing UK commentator said recently, to empty the bins, that's about as far as our government's powers stretch, we don't really have much opportunity to resist the kind of theft that's going on around us at the moment. But we do have, still, at the moment at least, some vestige of democracy. But if, as in the case of Venezuela and in the case of many other countries, democracy can be corrupted and undermined from within, and if you look back at 2014 and the way the independence referendum was illegally done, remember there were all sorts of rules broken by the United Kingdom in that referendum, and that was the only reason, I believe, why it failed. Then you can see that there are parallels here. The United Kingdom is not beyond doing a little bit of meddling in the democracy of Scotland, or removing people it finds offensive, finding some way of smearing people, or wrecking their reputations, having them removed from power in some disgrace. In the case of Alex Salmond, they tried that. They tried it in the case of Nicola Sturgeon. I'm just wondering what they might do to John Swinney. Frankly, I don't think they'll do anything to John Swinney because he's so mild-mannered and so inoffensive that it's very difficult to see him as a threat to anything at all, really. But, you know, that's just the way the world is at the moment. However, some good news as far as the people of Scotland and their quest for independence is concerned. Some polling recently showed that in the under 30 bracket of young Scots, somewhere between 75 and 78% of those young people are in favour of independence. Now that's a very big demographic shift. Now if you remember that every year more youngsters become old enough to vote. They reach the age of 18, they're able to vote, they're able to express their democratic will, and if they're coming into the voting demographic in these numbers, that shifts the arithmetic dramatically in favour of independence, because old codgers like me, who've been in favour of independence for decades, we're going to gradually die out, and we need to be replaced by these young, more vigorous and more committed young adults who are in favour of independence. And it's heartening to me to know that young people do feel this way. They see the United Kingdom as teetering on the brink of collapse. It has nothing left in the tank, almost literally, except Scottish oil and gas and Scottish renewables. And so they're going to try to hang on till the very last moment to every single ounce of oil, gas, every kilowatt hour of electricity that they can suck out of the Scottish economy before we finally get ourselves free of this. So it's going to be a battle, and it's going to need some energy. And people like myself and many others in my age bracket in this demographic, we're all getting a bit tired. And you can hardly blame us. I mean, I've been doing this blog now since 2013. And look where we are now. You know, we're 12 years later, more now, and we still haven't got any further. But that's because of people like Mr. Swinney. He's not strident enough. He's not willing to take risks. And if anything, this event staged by the United States is probably going to give them pause. Because if the United States is allowed to get away with it, the UK government is saying nothing about it, none of the other Western governments dared to take on Mr. Trump or his administration about this, then it's becoming normal that part of international law is that you're allowed to go and snatch whichever leader looks like they might not be a good egg, or doesn't come up to your standard, or isn't doing the kind of things that you really want them to do. And that's okay. Then where does that leave Scotland? Because our entire case for independence rests on the solidity of international law remaining in force. And if the United States is prepared to flaunt it completely, Russia is also prepared to flaunt it completely. What is the difference between America intervening and taking over Venezuela and Vladimir Putin trying to take over Ukraine for its natural resources? There really isn't that much difference. It's just in the execution, how it's been done, how it's being justified, but it's still the same thing. And we have to watch now that the United Kingdom doesn't get it into its head that now might be a good time to end devolution and just take back direct control of Scotland from people like Mr. Swinney and all the other elected officials who are responsible, according to the UK, for getting the bins emptied on time. So we have this problem, and we need to remember that the UK is not averse to learning lessons and copying the United States. It's been doing this for years. And the fact that they will not actually criticise the United States for its actions shows you just how much they're prepared not only to tolerate, but also to adopt as their own policy, their own foreign policies. So I think these are dangerous times we're living in. And 2026, if anything, strikes me as going to be more difficult for us than it was back in 2025. However, we need to stick to this, and we need to keep demonstrating, we need to keep doing programs like this, and we need to keep pointing out the flaws in the United Kingdom's grasp over Scottish resources, that they don't belong to London, they never have belonged to London. They don't also belong to the companies which are tapping into them. However, having said that, although they don't belong to those oil and gas companies and those electrical generation companies, they are given ownership, they're given rights by the United Kingdom government to exploit our resources for money, and in exchange for that, they pay a bit of tax to the UK Exchequer, and they pay a fee, believe it or not, to the Scottish Government for licensing to extract that energy from under our noses. This strikes me as us allowing ourselves to be robbed, and not only allowing ourselves to be robbed, but also accepting the table crumbs of the amounts of money which are paid in license fees by oil and gas extraction companies in the North Sea, and also electricity companies who don't really seem to pay anything very much and are building dams left, right and centre in the Highlands without any real concern for the natural environment, and erecting wind turbines on every square metre of windy land that there is, without really any let or hindrance. So we're being exploited, we keep being exploited, and the exploitation is now kind of adapting and evolving to suit the new energy sources which are being tapped, i.e. wind, wave, tide, etc. Whereas all of those sources actually belong to the people of Scotland and should be managed by the Scottish Government on behalf of the people of Scotland, in the same way that Norway managed its oil wealth fund, and yet we never did, because London wouldn't start an oil wealth fund, because they wanted to extract all the money, give it to the corporations who are, let's face it, paying for the politicians, supporting the parties, etc. So we live in a very corrupt United Kingdom, and the only way for us to free ourselves from that is to leave the corrupt United Kingdom and set up a legitimate government of our own, elected by us, to serve us and to take back control of the resources which are currently being extracted. Everybody knows this, and we have to keep making this point over and over again. It's also worth pointing out, I mentioned earlier, and I think I got this wrong, so let me make a correction. There was a poll recently of football fans, and with the football fans, they checked to see if any of the fans of these various big football clubs, and we're talking about Premiership clubs, supported independence. And what they found was quite shocking, that almost every single fan group for every single Premiership club in Scotland, there was less than 50% in favour of independence. Mostly it was about 45 to 48%, and the only exception to that in the Premiership was Kilmarnock fans, and they were marginally in favour of independence. I think they were in the low 50s. That's very strange. That means that Premiership football fans, by and large, didn't seem to support independence in 2014. How many Premiership football fans are on the voters' register? I don't really know, but in actual fact, this is an interesting demographic which nobody's ever considered before. Does supporting a football club make you more British and more likely to vote no to independence? I'd be interested to hear from football fans how they feel about this and whether this is reflected in their own personal experiences. It might be. And it would be interesting to discover just how widespread this opinion is within Premiership football club fan bases. I'm not that convinced that it is as widespread as that, and I'm also not that convinced that the polling is as accurate as all that, but we'll see. Anyway, that is it for me today. I will be back on your screens more regularly, and I'll be back with Nori, I hope, again on Friday this coming week to do our Hodma Jacob programme at 9:30 a.m. So I will be back on a more regular basis, but to be honest with you, this year's got off to a pretty crappy start if the Trump administration is anything to go by, and the disappointing response from both the British Prime Minister and the Scottish First Minister leaves me wondering what on earth they think is now acceptable. Anyway, so leave you with that thought. But remember, keep the faith, and I'll see you next time on Inde-Car. Bye for now.